Are you here? You are here, and we welcome you to episode number 1058 of the Paul Leslie Hour. Thank you for tuning in. President Donald J. Trump made an ultimatum to Hamas, designated as a terrorist organization by the United States since 1997. Quote Mr. Trump, "Release the hostages or face annihilation." Indeed, Edan Alexander, an American Israeli, still remains in captivity. Joining us to comment on this ultimatum from the president is Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. He's the author of Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, a guide to finding meaning and emotional wellness. This is an interview about more than just the situation in the Middle East. It also deals with man's search for meaning and healing from despair, depression, and anxiety. And before we bring on our special guest, please subscribe to Paul's YouTube channel. And if this interview resonates with you, tell someone you know who you think needs to hear it. And with that, it is time. Let's listen together.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. He is the author of the book Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, a guide to finding meaning and emotional wellness. He's also founder of the Mental Health First Initiative, the TMHFI, and we're going to come together and talk about a number of subjects in the news and a number of subjects that are, I think, pretty much eternal to the human condition. Rabbi Schonbuch, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Recently, it's been in the news. You could call it an ultimatum. I certainly would. President Trump sent this out just a few hours ago. Shalom Hamas means hello and goodbye. You can choose, release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. It goes on from there, and people can see the full message on the screen right now. What do you make of this message? It's very strongly worded.
Well, he's giving them an ultimatum. He's saying either or. I mean, there's an American Israeli still in Hamas captivity, probably in the tunnels in some dungeon in Gaza, Edan Alexander. This war is going on for over a year and a half. They're already in negotiations with each other, yet they're not giving over dead bodies. They're not giving over Americans. This is a cruel, cruel regime that wants the destruction of Israel, Jews around the world, the United States. And so I think Trump is taking the right stand. He's saying it's either all or nothing right now. Let's move on, but they're not willing to do so. This came on the heels of President Trump meeting with a whole bunch of hostages, as you saw in the White House a few days ago. So, he heard about the horrific stories that the hostages went through. I think it pushed him to act further and to make a clear stand against evil in the world.
What do you think is going to happen? We can guess and guess all day, but what is your gut telling you?
My gut's telling me that this is not over, that their power is holding on to the hostages. I've watched this for many years happening in the Middle East. People have short-term memories, because this is one of many instances where I remember in the 1990s and 2000s, Hamas was blowing up buses of civilians, hotels, restaurants in Israel. Let's not forget 9/11, which happens just after that. So I don't think they're stopping. Their mission is to destroy. They're not interested in peace. Israel was quite peaceful with them. 2005, they withdrew from the Gaza territories, left them alone. All they got was missiles and murder. And then on October 7th, everybody knew what happened. They came into Israel. The people they attacked were really peaceful, very peaceful people living on the southern border near Gaza. Many people had invited them in to their homes to help them, to get the medical care and other important things. Those very people were the people that were murdered. Out of the 1,200, villages were destroyed, communities were destroyed, people were raped, burned to death, 250 hostages brought into these horror tunnels, these terror tunnels, 350 miles of terror tunnels. They're not interested in peace. This is just a new tactic for now. They're preparing for the next attack. So I'm not so hopeful about what the Hamas is going to do. I am hopeful because I'm a spiritual person that things will work out in the long term. But on a political level, I don't see any resolution.
Rabbi Schonbuch, do you think that the average American has a good understanding of what is going on over there in Gaza?
Well, I don't believe they do. And the media in the West does not portray it in a very honest way. The media likes snapshots. Rush Limbaugh used to call it drive-by media. That's our media that we're living with today. They get little snippets. This has been fueled by TikTok. Of course, when people are getting killed by bombs, everybody is in horror, as we all are. But the reality is there's no context. So the news media cycle is rapid. There's no context information going on here. And therefore, they don't see the full picture when they're watching news. So they need interpretation to understand the history of rejection of Israel, history of rejection of Jews and Christians in the Middle East for 1,500 years. You know, the Jews and Christians are called dhimmi. We're second-class citizens under Islamic rule. The references, anti-Semitic and anti-Christian references in the Quran against the Jews are quite significant. I was just at a conference in Dallas last week, and I met with some Christian leaders from Beirut and Christian leaders from Iran. And every morning when they woke up, when they were in these places, they woke up, went to school, and had to say death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. So you can imagine a culture in multiple countries where they wake up preaching this every day. We see the implications. We see the murder that takes place. So I don't believe this is going to change. And I believe that we need to change people's ideas for this conflict to end.
How do you think we do that? How do we change people's ideas?
Well, number one is clarity. President Trump, Republican Party, the United States have to be very clear. I just watched a movie about Ronald Reagan a few weeks ago, and I grew up with Ronald Reagan as a teenager. And he said that clarity is power. So number one is clarity, good and evil. That's going to help the situation. Number one, we have to take a strong stance. Number two, we have to teach people about ethical monotheism. I'm also a big follower of Dennis Prager for many years. He talked about ethical monotheism. There's religion, there's God, and there's also love and ethics. So we have to teach people about that and hopefully convince them, but it's an uphill battle. It's not a very simple thing to do.
I know a lot of the listeners and a lot of the viewers are familiar with this, but it wasn't long ago I was near a college campus and I saw a bunch of people and they were holding these signs saying things like from the river to the sea. You know, there were lots of young people, but after observing for a while, I realized that it was being orchestrated or led by people who were much older, adults. Why do you think so many college students, so many young people have latched onto this idea of, even holding up signs that are supporting of Hamas?
There's a confluence between the left and radical Islam. Been building for the last 30 or 40 years. We have this concept of intersectionality. So the left, when you want to be embraced by the left, you have to take on all of the tenets of the left. And one of the tenets of the left is Israel is the small Satan, America is the great Satan. Islam and the left meet at that same point to destroy Judeo-Christianity. So people who are on the left on campus, many young people are on the left when they're at least in older, later years in high school and early college years. The professors, many of them are socialists. If we just do a survey of how many professors are Republican voters, how many are there? How many professors are Democrats on campus? We'll see probably 9-1.
Right.
9 Democrats to 1 Republican. The people that are propagating these ideas are on the left. And together, when we have a flashpoint in the Middle East, we can just start blaming the Jews and blaming Israel. Everybody tends to just work together. There's no historical context. TikTok, I believe, is social media on steroids. They're just seeing these images. So the left and Islam work together very well, and you're seeing this on Columbia University. That was last year. Just this last week, we saw what happened at Barnard College. People destroying some of the greatest institutions in the world, or when the left joins with Islam on our campuses. So I believe that's what's happening today, and we have to fight back. We have to be clear. We have to enforce our laws. We need strong leadership from the United States government saying this is wrong. We saw that with Elise Stefanik. If you remember, they were looking into anti-Semitism on campus, taking a strong position. In the end, when we take a strong position, we're going to see much better results.
And I know a lot of people are thinking, isn't it crazy that Hamas, which, for example, is has really nothing in common with a lot of people on the left, especially at colleges. How is it that these people have been deceived in such a strong way? Like you see people holding signs like trans for Hamas. I mean, you almost want to laugh.
Chickens, they were joking around chickens for KFC. If somebody was trans, homosexual in Gaza, in most Arab countries, will be murdered, just thrown off the roof and killed. So it's puzzling to me, absolutely puzzling, that these two forces can get together, but I think they have a greater enemy, which is Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian society. So they see the commonality of the destruction of the West. I talk a lot about this as a psychologist as well. Some of the ideas in psychology, which are on the canvas as well, are there to basically tear down the West, Western ideals, Judeo-Christian civilization. That's why they're getting together right now, and they're so potent. It doesn't make any sense, does it? But they're willing to do it for the greater destruction of Judeo-Christian civilization.
It's occurred to me that a lot of these people, not just young people, but people who are associating themselves with these very extremist groups and these extremist ideas, it's as if there's something missing inside and they're looking for something. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl. The purpose of my book was to talk about Viktor Frankl. And he predicted over 70 years ago something called the existential vacuum in the Western world. Unlike Sigmund Freud, who talked about man as a pleasure-focused entity, pleasure-focused animal, Frankl said man is searching for meaning. What we're seeing in the West today is exactly what he predicted over 75 years ago, this existential vacuum. When the vacuum exists, things come in to fill them in. And that's what we're seeing. Any new idea, specifically the ideas which deal with self-gratification, what I call hyper-individuality, will fill the gap. So things like TikTok go right into that zone. Values go right into that zone. Negative, anti-family values go right into that zone as well. Quick gratification, and that's what we're seeing happening today. And therefore we see the left also working together with that. And now Islam working together to take down the West. It's one global force against us of emptiness, anti-Semitism, and leftist ideology.
Tell us about that hyper-individuality. That is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I think Viktor Frankl talks about a concept called hyper-reflection, where people tend to focus too much on themselves. I see this as a psychotherapist. I specialize in treating depression, anxiety, and trauma. Frankl was against the trends in psychotherapy, specifically those of psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud. Freud said that man is an animal and God is an invention of man, so to speak. If you look at the structure of the unconscious mind, according to Freud, he said there's an id, a pleasure-seeking animal, ego and a superego, but there's no mention of the soul. And Frankl was, very extremely bothered by that. He said, no, man has a soul, and man desires to find meaning in his life. But if we take man as an animal, the eventual reality will be self-focus, hyper-individuality, only focusing on the self. Frankl was teaching in his books like Man's Search for Meaning, real emotional well-being and happiness comes when we go beyond ourselves. But that's exactly what we're confronting today. Hyper-individuality, focus on the self, and there's no end to it, basically. It just leads towards absolute destruction. It leads towards the destruction of the West, where we have zero population growth. That's the eventuality of hyper-individuality. What we need is people to think about community, think about family, think about values, think about others, to go beyond the self. That's where we see happiness ensue. That's when we'll see reduction of depression, anxiety, and addiction as well. And that's what we're facing in society today, hyper-individuality.
So how did you get this interest in Viktor Frankl? What was it that kind of drove you to write about him and study him?
Even before I was a psychologist many years ago, I read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And for those of you who read it, know that in the first chapter, he talks about Viktor Frankl. And I was fascinated by that idea. And then I became a psychologist afterwards. And I always reflected back on the fact that I never heard about in graduate school about Viktor Frankl and the search for meaning. I heard about it from Stephen Covey, a famous business coach. I was always puzzled by it. So I started going deeper into his works and his ideas. And I started practicing psychology in a different way with my clients. So instead of just focusing on their childhood or on their traumas, I started focusing on things like meaning and things like values. And I started seeing a more rapid change. I started seeing my clients are happier, they're doing better. And instead of focusing on themselves, which is hyper individuality, I started focusing on values and meaning, things beyond themselves, and they started to get much better.
I think everybody knows somebody who has been in therapy, or they've kind of resigned themselves to, they think, well, I'm just going to be taking antidepressant drugs for the rest of my life. I've had several people who tell me that that's the case for them. And I certainly don't feel like I'm in any position of expertise, but there's something about that that seems very disconnected to me. Do you think in some cases therapy is causing a lot of problems for people instead of fixing?
Well, in terms of the medication, before people take medication, I'm not against SSRIs, antidepressants, but they have to be used very carefully. I think doctors are too apt to prescribe them too early for their patients. People lead and run to them for quick results. But I believe that before one tries an antidepressant, one should try a good round of good therapy, a good round of logotherapy. Start exercising. That would be really helpful. And also engaging in spiritual practices. So for some people, that might be hiking, that might be visiting spiritual places, that might mean helping other people. And if all that fails after a few months, and God forbid if there's suicidal ideation, I would recommend some medication. But I think it's being used too quickly today. And there's many things people could do before they try medication. And there's implications for medication. There's a lot of side effects, a lot of symptoms. It affects families in ways which are unpredictable. So I say first try good psychotherapy, but not the classic psychotherapy. I think, Viktor Frankl said that paradoxically, too much focus on the self causes more depression and anxiety. So at a certain period, the therapeutic industry in itself is self-focused. It's not looking at the outcomes of what's really happening in people's lives. And I can show that. And in my book, for example, I have people choose values that are important to them, like loving kindness, caring for others, citizenship, spirituality, courage, creativity. I also ask them to pick from a menu of meaningful experiences in their life and commit to them week by week when I'm meeting with them. I'm finding out that it's a much more lucrative place to heal people from depression and anxiety than simply focusing on their past and their childhoods, as Sigmund Freud taught people to do many years ago.
You use this term logotherapy.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. That's interesting.
Well, Viktor Frankl was born in 1905 in Vienna. He grew up under the shadow of Sigmund Freud. He was a student of Sigmund Freud. He was eventually kicked out of the Sigmund Freud Society because he disagreed with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud created something called psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. It was looking at your childhood as the main factor influencing your behavior as an adult. He also didn't believe in God. He believed that God was made up by man to protect him. And Viktor Frankl really disagreed with Sigmund Freud, which was very difficult to do. 100 years ago, Sigmund Freud ruled the world in psychotherapy. In fact, most institutions of psychology and psychiatry, up till about 40 years ago, focused primarily on Sigmund Freud's model. Viktor Frankl believed that man's search is ultimately for meaning. And basically, he said that we have to focus on the acquisition of values and meaning. And he created something called logotherapy. Logos comes from the Greek word of spirituality or meaning. And therefore, he wanted people in therapy to uncover those deeper resources of spirituality and have them search for more meaning in their lives. He believed that's what logotherapy would do. And it's much more effective than psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud.
Not long ago, the conservative commentator Matt Walsh, he had a viral tweet in which he said essentially that there are very few people that he's encountered that were deeply depressed that he couldn't immediately see why it was that they were depressed. And I have to say, there have been more than a few times where I felt the same way. I thought, well, gosh, if I had that outlook, or if I was facing those things, I would be depressed too. What do you think of that?
Well, Viktor Frankl talked about ways of finding meaning. The first way is to help a person acquire a better job, something they're doing with their life. So he called that creative values. The second way is by loving someone,
Mhm.
looking for somebody to love in this world. Even if they're not necessarily loving you back, we're not talking about loving a narcissist. We're talking about your average person who's not a narcissist. Finding ways to love them, he says, that will be more fulfilling for you. Another way is by experiencing meaningful activities, nature, culture, art, music, going out in the world, going to a great concert or experience. But the third way is, he says, when you're facing inescapable suffering, when you cannot change the situation, the ultimate of human freedoms is to change oneself, to change one's attitude. So you could be facing something inescapable. There could be a reason that you're suffering, but even that, Frankl believed that you could actually change your attitude, so you reduce your sense of despair towards it.
What would you say to that person out there who says that they are looking for meaning, they increasingly look for it, and they just can't seem to find it?
So Frankl said that if a person says, I want to find meaning, they're not going to find it. He says life itself is asking you the question, and it's presenting to you endless possibilities of finding meaning right in front of you, right in your life right now. How you answer life in that moment through being responsible towards the moment and people and things around you is where you discover meaning. So that's the question people not need to ask. Not what is the meaning of life. Life itself is absolutely meaningful. How I respond is the question. So to choose things to do, to fix in the world, values to hold by. The question I tell my clients is like this. The question is not, what do I need? The question is, what am I needed for in this world? And that
Hmm.
could be a person, that could be a thing, that could be something you fix in life, that could be someone that you cure if you're a doctor, if you want to volunteer. And there's plenty of sadness and sad, terrible things in the world. You can go out and help people who are hungry. You can help people that are sick in this world. You can heal families. So the question is, what am I needed for in this world? Ask that question first. I believe the answer will just emerge. And then when you act responsibly towards that, then you're going to discover meaning.
It's amazing what writing can do as a process of discovery, both inward and outward. When you were writing your Viktor Frankl book, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, was there anything that you discovered as a result of writing your book?
Well, I discovered for me personally, as a rabbi and a very spiritual individual, I discovered that I brought psychology to spirituality. I brought spirituality to psychology, began to integrate both worlds. When you study psychotherapy, it's a very secular study. As I mentioned before, Sigmund Freud took out the soul. Most of psychotherapy followed on his footsteps. And so I never heard about Viktor Frankl. I had no means to integrate spirituality in therapy with people. So the reason I wrote my book, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, was to teach people a methodology in psychotherapy where the therapist or the coach or just a good friend can help you uncover your spiritual resources. So I was doing this naturally. I don't look upon my clients as being sick or ill. I look at them as whole and resourceful. And I'm looking for that spark within them, that spark. I started doing this intuitively years ago. And when I wrote my book, I wanted to take Frankl's ideas and make them very practical and usable. So in my book, I started formulating how to teach people how to seek out spiritual resources in their clients' inner worlds. And I started discovering them. And I found that changed me, because therapy then became not looking at pathology, but at man's greatness, awakening the giant, as the expression goes. That for me was elucidating and vivifying. I found more exciting. I found therapy more exciting, more enjoyable. And I'm hoping that my own attitude is infecting my clients as well to change.
I'm hoping you can tell us a little more about this, the Mental Health First initiative.
Well, I'm very, very concerned what's going on in the United States today. And we have explosive rates of depression, of anxiety, post-traumatic stress, trauma, and 100,000 people a year are being lost to fentanyl. We have some very serious problem. I have children, I have grandchildren right now. I'm looking at the world around me, and I'm very concerned what's going on. And I look back at Viktor Frankl's work, knowing he had an answer for people's problems today, because I believe the problem is the search for meaning. And therefore, I started this initiative to really educate and teach people about the modalities of Viktor Frankl, both from a professional perspective, if you're a therapist, or you just want to find more meaning in your life, reduce depression, reduce anxiety, help yourself with addiction. I think the answers lie in the work of Viktor Frankl, and my new initiative is trying to educate people about that.
Earlier on in the interview, you mentioned Dennis Prager, and my prayers, and I know a lot of people's prayers, are with Dennis right now, and we look forward to the day that his voice again comes through a radio microphone. Something that he had a big influence on me was his emphasis on gratitude. What role, Rabbi Schonbuch, do you think gratitude can play in someone's life if they're trying to improve it?
It's a remarkable thing, and I wish the best wishes to Dennis Prager and his family. But he's right. Gratitude is a transition from the self to other. The question is not what I don't have, it's what do I have already? That very switch, it's a Copernican 180-degree shift. When you appreciate what God's giving you right now, there might be things that you don't have, but there's so much that you do have today. Remarkable amount of access to ideas, to culture, to society, to values, to education, to clean air. Like appreciate what you have right now. With that attitude, you begin to switch from the hyper individuality. What don't I have is the question. To the hyper individuality. The question is, what do I have already? And I become thankful to something beyond myself, which is for many people God or even Mother Nature. It changes one's attitude. It changes one's emotions. It focuses outward and it really heals a person.
What are you the most grateful for?
Thankful I'm alive. I'm thankful for the opportunity to heal people. And I've been given the skills and the writing abilities and through learning certain modes of psychotherapy to change people's lives. So I'm so happy I have the opportunity to do this in my life. And I really dedicated my life to it for many years. And I'm hoping through my writings and my mental health initiative to help more people grow and to change and to become a better self, a better image of themselves.
You've been very generous with your time, but is it possible? Can I ask you some more questions?
Delighted. Go ahead.
Okay. Something that I see a lot of people saying that America should just completely not involve ourselves in any way with other countries. We should be completely non-interventionist, don't have anything to do with what's going on in the Middle East. A lot of popular conservative commentators have even expressed this. What do you think of that kind of thinking?
I think we have to be careful because we have enemies that are working very hard to destroy us. And it's percolating in places like Iran, which is one step away from getting a nuclear weapon and placing them on missiles to destroy Europe and eventually to destroy the United States. So as much as I believe in America first, I understand the ideals. We have to conserve our resources, take care of our population first. We also have to be very aware of what our enemies are trying to do to us. We have many, many enemies against the West. And if we let it percolate for too long, it's going to come to our seas. So it looks on the surface to be the right idea. I hope we can just incorporate a little bit more of worry about dangers around the world, like China, Soviet Union, Islamic republics, and so on. We have to be very careful because as much as we need to take care of ourselves first, the metaphor when an airplane, and if the airplane's losing pressure and the masks come down and you have a kid with you, put the mask on yourself first to save the other person. America has to renew our resources, our politics, our focus on what's important and our values. But I would not be one to give up our focus on the emerging evils in the world because they will come. to us nilly-willy, and perhaps least when we're expecting it, like on October 7th.
Hmm. Do you see the Republican Party a path to attract more Jewish people? I know that in this last election, I had read something to the effect that there were more Jewish people who voted for Trump than past Republican candidates. Can you talk about that?
The Jewish community, I'll speak for the Northeast where I grew up, was primarily supportive of the Democratic Party for many, many years. There were Jews in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish after the Holocaust and so on. But it's changed, and it's changed quickly. Over the last few years, the Democratic Party has become a party of radicalism, left-wing ideology, which inevitably is anti-Semitic. Their leaders, many of them are anti-Semitic publicly. I can go into the names if you want. And I believe it's a real wake-up call. And I'm really hoping through my speaking on radio shows and interviews like this to convince more Jews that the Democratic Party is a party of the past for our community. We have to become supportive of the Republican Party right now. We have to adopt their ideals. We have to support our leaders on the right in this country because they, in the end, will provide most freedom for us, independence, defense against forces in the world that want to destroy us in Israel. So I'm really hoping that the Jewish community will wake up, but I also believe they will change because there's a war of ideas.
Hmm.
And when I met Dennis Prager, I met him 40 years ago at a conference, actually. I was not religious. I was not a Republican. But he convinced me about the importance of conservatism, conservative values. He talked about ultimate values in life, having absolute values in life, something people could subscribe to, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. We need absolute values, not the muddied gray areas of the left where good is bad and bad is good. We have to be very clear. And I think what's happening now, I think there's a remarkable change taking place in the world under Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And I'm hoping that the Jewish community will wake up to it. I know a lot of young Jews and a lot of people my age as well are now supporting the Republicans. That's the growth you saw in this last election. I think it's only going to grow, and I'm hoping I could help it grow as well.
What do you think the biggest misconception about Israel is?
The biggest misconception is that it's not a Jewish homeland. I mean, we've been there for thousands of years. Thousands of years. If you look in the old city, the Western Wall, it's underneath the mosque. Our temple is buried underneath their mosque. The Jews have been there for thousands of years. Jews have always been in the land of Israel. It was only called Palestine by the Romans in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed our second temple. We have a rich history there. Jews started coming back because of the anti-Semitism in both Europe and the Islamic world. And then when we started coming back defending ourselves, Islam would not accept, the Arab nations would not accept the possibility of autonomy for a Jewish state in the Middle East. They would not accept that. So there's a great misconception. I believe this is not a political war. This is a religious war going on. And the Jews are considered, as are Christians, dhimmi, second-class citizens. The Quran is replete with references that are anti-Semitic. And that's the battle we're facing right now. So the American public only sees a external perception of what's going on. I hope people get to understand some of the values of the Arab world, the Islamic world right now, and what we're really facing on a very profound level. Another thing I want them to understand is, from my perspective, Israel is not requesting any American soldiers. Israel, a place I visited many times, is incredibly pro-American. America is loved. America is an ally of the United States. And what they need is our support, our diplomatic support, military support when necessary. I believe that together we're going to build a tremendous future in the Western world and for the rest of the Middle East. You know, there's amazing things happening miraculously from the Trump's first administration under the Abraham Accords, things that have never been possible. The Republican Party under Donald Trump's leadership is able to accomplish. That's a seismic shift that countries are signing peace deals with Israel. I think it's going to bring peace and prosperity. And I hope Americans and the Christian community understands how vital Israel is to the Western world and how much we need to support it. and this common culture we can build together and overlook the propaganda of the left and Hamas very carefully, because the enemies are, according to them, the United States, not just Israel. So I'm hoping people get a greater understanding of that.
You know, I put these different labels on you, that you're an author, that you're the founder of this initiative. Who do you say Daniel Schonbuch is? How do you define yourself?
Myself, I'm a secular Jewish boy born in New York in 1966. I talk about in my book, Viktor Frankl talks about in his works something called the religio. See, Sigmund Freud talked about the id, this pleasure-focused animal within a person. Viktor Frankl talked about something called the religio, that spiritual spark. And when I met Dennis Prager 40 years ago, and I started looking at suffering in the world, somehow I was just spiritually just aroused by what Frankl would call the religio. I spent my whole life, the last 40 years, thinking about how to manifest that spirituality in the world. And for me, psychotherapy can be a very lucrative place to help people heal and to grow. So I see my call in life is to bring together both the worlds of psychology and spirituality to bring the world to a better place. And that's who I believe I really am. And the thing that excites me most is watching people change. I don't know where it comes from. Frankl speaks about the religio as an impulsive, spontaneous thing that some people just realize that there's a God in the world, that there's a soul, and do something about it. I feel that defines who I am since I was a teenager. And therefore, I'm here to heal, to transform, and to elevate.
Well, we have covered so many subjects today, from Viktor Frankl to Israel to our friend Dennis Prager. I always like to end my interviews, I just give the guest the stage, so to speak. We just never know who is listening, when. Sometimes something resonates much later with somebody. For anybody who's tuned in with us, what would you say to that person?
Most Americans have experienced psychotherapy on some level. Millions of Americans go to psychotherapists. But if they're listening out there and still suffering from depression and anxiety, after a good course of months or years of psychotherapy, they've been looking in the wrong place. I think it's time to transform the world of psychotherapy. That's why I started my mental health initiative. It's time to go to the next stage, which is what Viktor Frankl calls as logotherapy, is to combine together their need for feeling better emotionally with the search for meaning. And if they just hold on to Frankl's ideas and read his works, or perhaps read my book, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, they're going to see rapid changes in their life. And there'll be tremendous results and side effects of those changes. They'll become more outwardly focused. Viktor Frankl said that happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And it does so when a person searches for meaning. So I hope people can make that shift. If they're lonely, if they're addicted, if they're depressed or anxious, make the shift to go beyond oneself, search for meaning, and happiness will follow you. And I hope that people will take what I'm saying very seriously, and I believe they're going to see significant changes in their lives.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been a very interesting experience. I don't know what it is, but sometimes you see something and you just have an urgency. And when I started reading about you, I had an urgency. I thought, I need to speak to this man immediately. And here you are.
It was such an honor to meet you, and what a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and to engage with you and allow me to express things I don't usually express in public. I thought you really allowed me to do that in a very profound way. So I'm glad we both urgently felt the need to talk together today.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it a lot. If I can ever be of service, please let me know.
Take care.
All right. Bless you.
The Paul Leslie Hour is made possible by people like you, listeners, viewers. Please go to thepaulleslie.com/support, and you'll know what to do when you're there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who contributes. performance of The Entertainer intro song by John Primorano. And of course, this is your announcer speaking. See you next time on the Paul Leslie Hour.